Hi, everyone. Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are, and wherever you are, like listening or watching us. Welcome back again. Design Post-COVID Humanity, Taruf, Ta'awun, and Tarahum Initiative. It is really an amazing group of individuals, teams, and we're so honored to have you guys. So today we have two amazing professors from Hamad bin Khalifa University. I will briefly introduce them to you. Also, I would like to acknowledge that they are not just professors that I know by name, but they are also my colleagues from the college that I see them almost every day, of course, before COVID. And now, hopefully, we'll keep seeing each other like in the near future physically, but we are all in the same building. And let me first briefly introduce Professor Alexandre Caeiro. He's an associate professor, and he was trained in sociology and Islamic studies in France, Netherlands, and Egypt. His research deals broadly with the transformations of Islamic law in modern contexts. He is currently working on the legal history of Gulf Sheikhdoms, focusing on the interaction between the emirs, Sharia judges, merchants, and British agents in the context of the development of an oil economy and modern state institutions. After Professor Alex Caeiro, we will be having Dr. Frank Peter, who is an assistant professor of Islamic studies, and he studied modern history, Islamic and Middle Eastern studies, and Arabic in Hamburg. Before joining HBKU, he was an assistant professor of Islamic and Middle Eastern studies at the University of Bern, where he received his habilitation in Islamic studies with a forthcoming monograph entitled Islam and the Governing of Muslims in France, Secularism Without Religion. He has co-edited a number of volumes, including Islamic Movements of Europe, Public Religion, and Islamophobia in the Modern World, and Islam and the Politics of Culture in Europe, Memory, Aesthetics, and Art. So we are honored to have these two amazing professors, two prolific professors with us. And there, Alex and Frank, the floor is yours. Please, whenever you feel like, please share the screen and we will kickstart.
Okay, so Assalamu alaikum everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm sharing my screen now. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we do. Yes, we do, Professor.
Perfect. All right. So I'm going to speak about Islam and social justice, a case study from the Gulf. And I'm going to talk about history a little bit. I don't know how familiar you are with the Gulf, but the main economic activity and source of employment in the Gulf before the advent of oil was the pearling industry. Okay? And so the pearling industry occupied in places like Qatar almost the entire male population during at least 4 seasons. And we have some photographs, early photographs. I don't know how clear they are, but you can see this is a typical pearling boat. And you see the divers in the water and the howlers pulling them into the boat. The divers, of course, were perhaps the most vulnerable members of the crew, because they faced many hardships. They dived without any equipment. Throughout the history of the Gulf, diving was non-mechanized. There was no equipment that was introduced. In fact, the British authorities opposed the introduction of equipment. And so they would dive and they would face many physical hardships in order to find the oysters from which pearls are extracted. There were other actors in addition to the divers. There were howlers, and howlers are the ones you see on your left, the people who stayed on the boat and pulled the divers back from the sea quickly once they ran out of air. Okay, so that was also a very physically extenuating job, even though it did not involve diving in the Gulf. There were also, of course, merchants of various kinds, traders and merchants. They're called tujar or tawashin. These are names that are given to different kinds of merchants involved in the pearl trade. And the pearl banks occupied, basically, were spread throughout the Gulf, the Arabian Persian Gulf. There were more banks with oysters on the Arabian side, and these were because the waters are shallower than on the Persian side. But there are also pearl banks from which oysters and pearls could be extracted on the Persian side, scattered around the coast all the way from Kuwait in the north to Oman in the south. All right, so there was a pearl boom in the late 19th century, a pearl boom that really started development across the Gulf and brought unprecedented wealth to the region. This is sometimes forgotten in histories that focus on the oil era. And of course, oil represents a rupture, but already by the 19th century, by the late 19th century, there was an unprecedented flow of wealth to the Gulf Sheikdoms that allowed projects, infrastructures, purpose-built mosques, and so on to be built, and the first schools and hospitals, right, profited from this pearl boom. So the best years for pearling, the pearl boom started in the mid to late 19th century and peaked really around 1912, 1914, right? And the reasons for the pearl boom had to do with demand for pearls from Europe and North America, right? That reoriented the trade and that created new opportunities and raised the prices for pearls far beyond what was known. So pearls had no local value as such. They were not used as items of consumption here in the Gulf. They were mostly sold in markets abroad. And you have here a brief calculation. It's from an important work by Loraymer, the gazetteer of the Persian Gulf, that shows you how much the prices increased between 1873 and 1906. Okay, so pearl peaked around just before the First World War. After the First World War, during the First World War, there was a crisis, of course. After the First World War, there was a slight renewal and increase in profits, but it never really captured, the pearl market never really captured the same profitability that it had in the 1910s. The world economic crisis in 1929 would throw the market into disarray, allied with the discovery in Japan of a method for producing cultured pearls, right? That really lowered the price and created a crisis and a recession here in the Gulf. So by the 1940s, pearling was no longer meaningful as an economic activity, and it ceased to exist in the 1950s. So this is a brief history of pearling, right? And now, pearling no longer exists as an economic activity, but is very much present in the landscapes of contemporary Gulf states. It has become part of national heritage and celebrated as such. So here in Doha, we have annual pearl diving competitions. This year it did not take place because of the pandemic, but it usually takes place where people go out on these traditional boats, the dhows, and try to collect as many pearls as they can get. And pearling or pearls are also symbols that adorn the urban landscapes of cities across the Gulf. Here you have an image of the Pearl Roundabout in Manama. There are museums dedicated to the pearls in Dubai, Ras Al Khaimah, and other places. There's even a World Heritage Site known as the Pearling Trade in Manama. These initiatives are not only state-driven. There are many individuals who can cultivate an interest in pearling and have their own private museums or shops. So pearling really is everywhere. People collect documents, pearling licenses, accounting books, stamps related to pearling, and so on. Accompanying this, there's of course a large historiographical and literary production today in the Gulf related to pearling in various dimensions. And here you have just a brief titles of the range of works that discuss pearling for publics of different ages and different audiences. Okay, it's also a source of inspiration for many artists. This is a painting that is currently being exhibited at the Mathaf, the Arab Museum, or the Museum of Arab Modern Art here in Doha, where the painter inscribes pearling into a kind of national narrative of development and progress, right? And pearling also now comes to become a source of inspiration for private entrepreneurs and artists. Here, it's turned into a carpet that you can purchase by a local artist. Okay, all right. So these are some of the ways in which pearling features in contemporary Gulf states. But I want to step back and ask, what was pearling really like until the advent of oil, right? What kind of an activity was it? How does this celebration of pearling today relate to pearling in the past? And what one finds when one starts looking at the organization of the pearling industry is that it was really a difficult and harsh industry. It was written with social hierarchies at all levels, between sailors, between boat captains and divers, between pearl merchants and boat captains, and between pearl merchants and capitalists and so on. The conditions of divers were often abject. They were very difficult working conditions. The divers were in a state of chronic indebtedness. They actually went diving every year, basically to pay off their debts from previous years. So boat captains would advance money to the divers and charge them interest upon them, upon these advances, right? And so divers would be committed to go diving for the pearl, for the boat captain, in order to pay off their debts. And they never managed to, or rarely managed to, fully pay their debts. So they were in a state of constant indebtedness. There's also a suspicion of corruption. Many divers were illiterate, and they were given money, but also more often goods, whose prices they did not really know how to estimate. They were also unaware of the real prices of pearls. Estimating a price of pearl was a complex affair, and boat captains and pearl merchants often kept the details of their sales secret. So there was a suspicion of corruption and unfair distribution of profits across the pearling industry. While it is clear that pearl merchants benefited a lot from the profits of the pearling industry, the main workforce of divers and haulers seemed to have profited very little and lived on kind of day-to-day subsistence. Finally, the pearl industry was also heavily reliant on slave labor. And the photo that you have here on the right is a photo of some of the divers and opening the oysters on the deck of a boat that is currently on display on the Bin Jalmoud House, which is a museum in Doha that sheds light on slavery in the Indian Ocean, right? And it is estimated that maybe a quarter of the diving population was made of enslaved Africans. Okay, so pearling was really a harsh business, right? And in 1923, while I was looking through the British archives, I found a speech by Lieutenant Colonel C.J. Knox, who was then acting political resident in the Persian Gulf. So from the mid-19th century until, well, 1970s, the Gulf, as you know, was a British protectorate, right? And so the most important political authority was the British political resident that was established here initially in Bushehr and then moved on to Bahrain. And this is an important quote that comes from a speech that the acting political resident made in Bahrain on a momentous occasion. The British decided that Sheikh Isa al-Khalifa was blocking many of the reforms they wanted to implement in Bahrain. And they esteemed that Sheikh Isa who had ruled the country since the late 19th century, needed to be removed. And so they installed his eldest son, Sheikh Hamad. This was a controversial gesture. Many local notables objected to this move, but nevertheless, the British went ahead and succeeded in installing the more Aminas and modernizer Sheikh Hamad. And during his speech, this is a speech that was delivered in Arabic by Lieutenant C.J. Knox to the local audience of notables gathered for the coronation of Sheikh Hamad. He decides to mention the plight of the pearl drivers, right? And so he says, pearl diving, the pearl trade is the source of wealth of these islands. It furnishes the reason why foreigners flock to Bahrain in such numbers and build fine houses. And on it are founded the prosperity, cleanliness, and well-meaning of Manama, the capital of Bahrain. And yet I know, the political agent knows, Sheikh Hamad knows, the Qadi, Sheikh Jassim bin Mahza, and you all know, and above all, the divers know, that it is a plague spot of these islands. Labor is in a position little short of lifelong slavery. Trickery, fraud, and oppression are rampant in the trade. And what are any of us doing to remove these evils? It is almost impossible to get respectable people to serve in the Salifa court. Nakhoda's boat captains steadily refuse to produce their accounts, and if they did, divers, who are dumb-driven cattle, would not understand them. And yet, who cares or gives real thought to all of this suffering? So this is a striking quote, and there's a lot of things that one could say about it. It seeks to alert the local notables to the plight of the divers, and it identifies a number of actors here. Okay, you might not be familiar with all of them. The political agent is a British official, right? He works in the India government under British rule, and he's a subordinate of C.J. Knox. Sheikh Hamad is the newly installed ruler, I mean technically crown prince, but de facto ruler. And the Qadi, Sheikh Jassim bin Mahza, is the only figure other than Sheikh Hamad that is directly mentioned by name, right? And all of these figures are seen as either corrupt or inefficient or indifferent to the plight of pearl divers, right? And so I thought this was an interesting provocation for me to think about what role could Muslim scholars play in the organization of the pearl trade. To what extent were they willing to defend the rights and interests of marginalized divers in the cosmopolitan pearling towns of the Gulf? How should one interpret this interpellation of Sheikh Qasim bin Mahza? What sources might be available to answer these questions? So in the interest of time, I'm going to run through some of these questions, some of these issues, and maybe you can ask me questions if things are unclear, right? And so my conclusions are, after having done a little bit of research, is that in the Gulf Sheikdoms, the situation was very legal pluralistic. There were Rulers working alongside tribal sheikhs, qadis, merchants, and British officials acting as legal agents, settling cases and disputes. And in the jurisdictional authority, who has authority to rule over a particular case, was not always clearly defined. The role of the qadi and of Muslim scholars more generally in pearling was actually quite limited. The cases between captains and divers or any conflicts that needed arbitration were typically referred to arbitration boards known as salifa or salifa courts, right? Where pearl merchants, right, who often came from the same tribes as the boat captains, adjudicated, right? And so what you can see here is that there's a conflict of interest, right? You know, the judiciary here is very closely aligned with both captains and pearl merchants, tribally, socially, and so on. And the pearl divers were often much more heterogeneous, in many cases foreigners or Bedouins coming from Najd. They were often left to fend for themselves. And so for the British, for example, the Salifa court would never rule in favor of the divers, would always rule in favor of the captains, okay? So what role could Muslim scholars play in this context? Sheikh Qasim bin Mahza is the figure that was identified by the acting political resident in his speech. And he is, in many ways, he is a symptom of this kind of integration between Islam and the tribal structures of the Gulf Sheikdoms and the interest of the pearl trade, because he was a Sharia judge, a Hanbali scholar, right? But his brother was a well-known pearl merchant, okay? And he is known for his rigorous application of Islamic law and defender of legal autonomy from political intrusion, and also an opponent of British power and Christian missionary presence in the region. What does he have to say about pearling? Well, while I was looking in the British archives, I found this letter. It is, I think, an incomplete letter, and there's no context to this letter. But the letter is interesting because it is from 1921, 2 years before the speech of C.J. Knox. It is part of the British record, so I'm assuming here that the British were aware of Sheikh Qasim bin Mahza's positions regarding pearling. What does he say? Well, in this letter, what he tries to do is, well, first of all, he displays quite in-depth knowledge of the pearl trade. And what he does is to place limits and constraints on the economic behavior of the more powerful actors. Okay, so he wants to define what is legitimate and what is sinful, and so he would allow things that were commonly practiced, such as a merchant who takes possession of a boat and the crew of an indebted boat captain. Nevertheless, he also sets limits. He prohibits merchants from taking possession of the captain's home as the repayment for debt. He also construes the income from pearls as a divine favor, right? So drawing on the famous Quranic verse. And he exhorts merchants to refrain from injustice and greed. He condemns very harshly those who demand additional compensation on the loans, which he deems to constitute riba, usury, prohibited in the Sharia. And he also emphasizes the importance of selling pearls in front of divers and report earnings correctly. Pearling was a profit-sharing endeavor, right? And so the divers would receive a fraction of the profits. But of course, if the profits were not correctly reported, divers would not get their due. And this is how he finishes the letter. Regarding the claim that ship owners do not present the records to the rulers and judges and do not pay the divers, this is an injustice and darkness of crimes and sin. It constitutes a form of ownership of a free man who is treated like an animal or slave. The skies, the earth, and the upper world, including the angels and the humans, shake for these misconducts and grieve for the wrongdoings. These mischiefs and injustices lead to enslavement of people. which is what happens in reality. So grasp and understand this from us, because it is the people who are astray who support one another. So these are very strong words, and it shows how an Islamic authority could rely on the moral powers of the Islamic tradition in order to try to moralize the trade, and in order to try to call for the protection of the rights of divers. In fact, after the speech, we also know that Sheikh Qasim became a regular interlocutor of British officials, and in fact, one of the few local notables who supported the reforms that the British authorities undertook in the 1920s. He's also remembered as someone who advocated for the divers during the riots. And so perhaps in C.J. Knox's speech, the interpellation of the Muslim judge sought to mobilize the powers of the Islamic tradition, because he knew, the British knew, that Sheikh Qasim would be favorable to the humanitarian project of improving the plight of the destitute divers. Okay, all right, so let me just conclude then briefly. Islam in the Gulf before oil was neatly integrated into the tribal structures of society. What that means is that tribal norms and customs dominated the social and legal spheres. The evidence is quite scarce, but there are letters and there are also fatwas that suggest that Muslim scholars were one of the few members of society who played an active role in the promotion of rights of divers and in the criticism of the unequal arrangements in the pearling industry. Whereas some pearl merchants became very rich during the pearl boom, most divers remained destitute throughout. And according to the sources we have, it seems that Hanbali scholars and Salafi scholars became more vocal in their criticisms of the pearl trade in the first half of the 20th century. They condemned the forced conscription of indebted divers. They also critiqued the profit that was generated through usurious loans, and they disapproved of a number of contractual arrangements between sailors. So was Islamic law and Islamic scholars a voice for social justice? And what were the limits of their interventions? Well, how effective were they? I mean, this is a question that I want to leave open, and I want to end just with a quote from a local historian who actually highlights that Muslim scholars and Islamic law might have played a more ambivalent role in the regulation of the pearl trade that is sometimes assumed. Okay, so I want to stop here. I think I've run perhaps a little bit beyond my time. So thank you for your time. Dr. Evren or Dr. Frank, how are you?
Thank you so much, Dr. Alex, for this wonderful presentation. Would you like to receive some questions now, or would you like to prefer to wait until the end?
I'm happy, whatever works best.
Let's ask, let's wait for the audience. They're participants of Design Post-COVID Humanity program. Are there any questions that you would like to pose right now to Dr. Alex? If you want, please just raise your hand and unmute yourself and share your question or comment or reflection. Okay, it's a very interesting topic. Anyone?
Hi, I have a question, and I'm not sure. Like, first, thank you for the presentation, and second, I'm not sure if I've got it right. Like, were the people, like the Muslim scholars who were speaking against unlawful economic transactions, were they prosecuted for that, or is what something more like political, just a debate? You know what I'm saying?
Could you repeat the question? It wasn't entirely clear.
The internet is slow, but Dr. Alex, my understanding of the question is, you shared examples of how the system is kind of moralized through Islamic law, right? So I think the participant is asking if there are claims of otherwise, like the other opposite claims that there are problems, there are records of cases of abuse or malpractice or manipulation in the or exploitation in the system. I think that's the question.
Okay, so let me take that one then. So what is important to realize is that the accusation that the British officials leveled during that speech by C.J. Knox and more generally elsewhere was that society was indifferent to the plight of the pearl divers. And that whenever there were cases of conflict, the judges that adjudicated those cases always sided with the merchants and the captains, right? Because they didn't want any problems, right? And the judges were pearl merchants themselves and came from same tribal groups as the merchants and the captains, right? And so just in order to, because they were careful men and they didn't want to stir up any trouble for themselves, they would just let the rule in favor of the boat captains and the pearl merchants against the divers, right? And so these were not Islamic scholars. Islamic scholars played a marginal role in the pearl trade, right? This is, however, what I'm trying to show is that they were not indifferent to the plight of the pearl divers, and they used opportunities that they had in order to try to alert for the injustices that pearl divers could face, and also try to make the more powerful members of society more sensitive to the hardship that pearl divers face. So they used opportunities like speeches, fatwas, in order to raise awareness and in a sense moralize the pearl trade. What I mean by moralize the pearl trade is to bring the pearl trade under moral rules that would emancipate or at least favor the marginalized divers. Right? Even though the judges themselves, the Islamic scholars themselves, came from the same tribal groups as the boat captains and the pearl merchants, right? And so they had all reasons to be careful too. But I think what I'm trying to say is that the Islamic tradition offered them reasons to leave their comfort spaces, to go beyond their comfort zones, and to speak in the name of justice, even though that might run against their family's interests or their tribal group's interests.
Dear Dr. Alex, I see a comment by Sabika Shaban, our colleague actually from College of Islamic Studies. She says, "Thank you for the amazing talk, Dr. Alex. Just a comment. I found Abdul Sharif's Dhow Cultures of the Indian Ocean an incredible read, highlighting some of the aspects of life on sea you shared. It also spoke about how life on the littoral was almost a separate culture from the more inland cultures. However, it does look at social justice on the sea from a slightly rosier lens than what you shared. Thanks again."
Yeah, I mean, so it's a good question, right? So I think thank you, Savika, for that comment. Much appreciated. It is difficult to know exactly how harsh the pearl trade was for the divers. I think in British sources, one finds very regularly comments that equate divers with slaves because of this chronic indebtedness, right? And also, if you speak today to many people in the region, some people would feel a real discomfort with the celebration of pearling as national heritage in light of all the social hierarchies that structure the pearl trade. Many people cannot identify with the celebration of pearling that is currently taking place. And so I think a question of what moral judgment does one give on a world that is quite different from us, a world that was, by all accounts, very poor, right, and difficult for everyone, right? It's tricky. So to judge, it might be tricky to judge certain practices in light of our own moral standards today. But Muslim scholars did feel that there were many injustices at the time, so in the early 20th century, against the pearl divers. And they also, in a sense, helped to confirm the British diagnosis of corruption and oppression and hierarchies structuring the trade. So, so those are various accounts that need to be put together. So in a way that is allows us to get a better sense of what the situation was. So thank you so much for the comment.
Thank you, Dr. Alex, for the amazing explanation and answer, and thanks for the question and comment, Sabika. I see one hand, Esnera. You asked your question, or because the first question, I'm not sure who asked actually. Esnera.
No, I haven't asked yet.
Okay, please, let's save your question, and afterwards we'll shift to the presentation of Frank. Please share with us your question.
Yeah. Can you hear me actually?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Again, assalamu alaikum. I'm Esnara. I'm from the Philippines. So personally, I do not have much knowledge about the Gulf history. But your presentation is very much appreciated. I have two questions actually. One is that continuing with what you have with the first question, I'm curious, what is the source of limitations of the limitations on the Islamic scholars? Why can't they, because my idea is that in an Islamic world, especially the Gulf states, my idea is that it's an Islamic world, so they must have like a role in the society that is like they can intervene in some cases. And I know that they actually do not agree with the status quo at the moment, but you said that they have a very limited control, or like they cannot intervene. So what's the source of limitation? And second is that since you said it's pre-oil era, how did this kind of system continued in the advent of the oil industry, and how did it change? What are the things that were carried out, and what did change from that kind of system? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Those are great questions. So the idea, the Gulf sheikdoms, right, were a complex social organization, and if you start thinking about who are the legal authorities in the Gulf sheikdoms in the late 19th and early 20th century, what you find de facto is that there's a number of different actors that actually settle disputes and act as judges, right? Now, you should not imagine like full-fledged courts and legal procedures, because that was not how the system worked, right? It was much more informal. So sometimes this was in a coffee shop. People would settle disputes in a coffee shop, or in the majlis of a ruler, right, of a local sheikh, or a tribal sheikh, okay? And so what you have is actually de facto, in reality, a number of different legal actors. And in some places there were Muslim judges. In other places, there's no sign of Muslim judges operating. Now, Muslim judges would typically officiate issues related to marriage, divorce, inheritance, awqaf, right? Waqfs, endowments, right? Important questions would be settled not by the Muslim judge, but by the emir, or in case of tribal conflicts, people would not go to the Qadi or to the Emir, but they would go to a tribal sheikh. Okay, and so this is what the situation was. People had an understanding that each of these, let's call them normative systems, was important, but each had its own place. It would seem implausible to go to a Muslim judge and ask him to arbitrate a conflict between tribal groups, for example, or a conflict between a pearl merchant and a boat captain, right? Because these conflicts had their own legal forums, right? And for the pearl trade, the legal forum was what was known as the Salifa, right? A Salifa was like an arbitration board, and the judges there were pearl merchants, people who knew the trade, people who knew how to estimate the value of a pearl, and people who knew what were the customary norms that determined the rights and obligations of divers, boat captains, and so on. So if a diver was sick, where he had committed himself to go diving for a boat captain, what were his rights and obligations for the following season, for example, or someone who could not pay their debts. These questions were almost never brought to the Qadi, as far as we know. They were never brought to the Muslim judge. They were always brought to this panel of experts that were known as the Ahla Salifa, pearl merchants who would decide on these cases. So there is a sense that if you want to think about the legal structure of the Gulf before oil, you have to think about in terms of a pluralistic structure of these different pluralistic actors with their own norms, customary norms, Islamic norms, tribal norms that served as guides for arbitrating conflicts. And this may run against some ideas about Sharia being all-encompassing in the pre-modern past of the Muslim world, right? So that's something that we need to think about. The second question that you're asking is what has changed? So what has changed with the advent of oil is that the Gulf Sheikhdom started to establish state bureaucracies, started to develop state institutions. So they created formal courts and formal judges and procedures, right? For a long time, these were undertaken under the British authorities because the British protectorate lasted until the 1970s. And so for a long time, there was a dual system where there was an Islamic legal system for some matters and a civil legal system for other matters, right? Which lasted more or less until in Qatar, it lasted until the 1990s. Okay, but over time, what happened is that the nation state centralized the legal sphere and made legal structures, legal procedures, all part of its purview. So the state took control of the legal sphere and kind of marginalized, or in some cases, incorporated other legal actors. So, but that's an interesting story that also needs to be told in more detail. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, dear Professor, and also Estera for the question. And so, Dr. Alex, we are extremely grateful for your support and contributions to the program. If you would like to stay for the next presentation, please, you're more than welcome. But if you have time limitations, we totally understand. It was such an honor to host you in Design Post-COVID Humanity, and hopefully in the Ramadan Summit, DPCH Summit, we would like to have you one more time, as we discussed earlier, and for a different format of presentation. And Professor Frank, welcome back again.
Yes.
So the floor is yours. Would you like to share your presentation on the screen?
Yes, if that's possible, yes.
Okay. And I'm really happy that we reached approximately 60 students. This is such a really great crowd, actually. Thanks for everyone. Thanks to everyone for their attendance and good questions, good interaction. And
it's like, do you see my slides now? Or
yes, but we see them small. Like if you, I wonder if you're gonna make it bigger or.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, perfect. The floor is yours, Professor.
Great. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thanks for having me. I wanted to present some slides and think about the question like how social sciences can contribute to a mutual understanding, right? So mutual understanding refers simply to understanding between people who define themselves as different in some significant respect, right, in relation to language, religion, nationality, etc. Right? So the question is then like, is there like a special contribution by social sciences to furthering mutual understanding, and like what would it look like, very roughly? Right? So now asking that question partly because as many people have observed, there's like something like a paradox. On the one hand, so many people and institutions claim to support mutual understanding, to further mutual understanding. On the other hand, one often asks whether any kind of progress has been made. Right? There's so much controversies, which can lead you to ask like whether this aim of achieving a mutual understanding is not really more difficult than it may seem at first sight, right? And explaining this difficulty is also, of course, what I would like to think about. Right? So the case, I want to refer to some examples, and these examples have to do with freedom of speech and respect of others. So freedom of speech in relation to what people say, what people write, images they produce, etc. That's just a shorthand way for talking about freedom of speech and expression. And so that's a good example for thinking about freedom of speech, the role of social sciences and mutual understanding, because as a right, it is enshrined in the Declaration of Human Rights from 1948, which includes this article: everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. So as this kind of right, it has some authority. People refer to it. People refer to it to legitimate what they're doing. At the same time, it has been ever since this right was consecrated, or even before, during the preparations, it was contested. And one central set of critiques has to do with whether free speech is an absolute right, and whether the principle of free speech implies really that people can say whatever they want, or what kind of criteria, standards exist to regulate free speech in relation to the sensibilities of other people, right, who share the same social space with the speaker.
Professor, sorry for interruption.
Yes.
I'm just wondering, there's a background noise. I wonder if it is coming from your side or another side. I checked all the mics, all of them seem closed, but is your microphone maybe touching something, or it feels like a window cracking, or I'm not sure if others are also hearing it or just me.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, like, you know, they should be okay. I don't know. I will continue, right? So I mean, and there's nothing about the computer is fine, and the mic also should work.
It was feeling like a window or something. I'm not sure.
No, I mean, it's not a window. I mean, that's like definitely not. So it's quiet here.
Oh, really? Okay. Interesting, because
there's no aircon, no windows. It's
okay. Sorry for that. It seems other participants are hearing too, but it stopped now actually. Excellent. Now? Okay, excellent. Sorry for the interruption. Yeah.
No problem.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. So some examples for this to illustrate this. So recently, as you perhaps saw, there was like this controversy about the publication of the so-called Charlie Hebdo cartoons, offensive images of the Prophet Muhammad. So, and when these cartoons were published again after like many years, 15 years of debate, one central question, critique was precisely that the journalists simply had willfully not taken into consideration the sensibilities of other people. They had willfully ignored them, and in that sense, of course, like this exercise of free speech was not a legitimate one, right? And this led to global protests. You can see the French president and the Turkish president who participated in this. Now, this is like one controversy which made the headlines, and of course, there are like many other local controversies about offensive speech, which sometimes then end up in courts and are mentioned in the media, but really do not provoke so much debate as in the previous case. So this is like one example, not typical, but an interesting example. An Austrian lady in Austria who was convicted for disparagement of religious precepts because in her like public seminars, but really small scale seminars on Islam, she had disparaged, denigrated Islam, right? And this was like confirmed by the European Court of Human Rights some time ago. So not typical, as I said, but like it's an interesting case, and I will come back to it, just as an example for like these small-scale controversies which take place really very often in many places, and these kind of like small controversies, in a sense, like feed into like debates where the issue is then like general rules and principles, right, which regulate our society and like free speech interaction between people in society. And one example for this is then the Doha debates from some time ago already, where the question debated was whether censorship of art is permissible, right? So the motion was, this House believes censorship makes a mockery of the arts, right? Like an idea which is typical in the sense that here a strong connection is being established between the idea that freedom of speech is absolute in the realm of the arts, right? And I think the majority of people approved of this motion ultimately, right? So now I want to turn to like remedies, like what can you do? What can you do to further mutual understanding? And as you noticed, my question was like a double question in the sense that I was asking not only like what can social sciences do, but whether they can make a significant contribution and what kind of contribution it would be. So if I'm more cautious, why am I more cautious with regard to what social sciences can achieve? I'm more cautious in a sense because you can argue that mutual understanding basically happens on the individual level, or it fails and on the individual level. And what is really essential for it is the commitment of these individuals to some basic values, right? And so this is, I think, an argument which has something to it. And if you go back to this case of the Austrian woman, for example, as this case went through several stages and all kind of courts discussed it, we have a pretty good sense of like what this woman attempted to achieve and like what her attitude was with regard to the topic of Islam. From her, we know this from her and from witnesses, and we know, and this is what the court concluded, that she did not try to relay a statement of fact, right? But she intended disparagement, right? She was told that like her statements would be offensive, and she didn't mind. She thought that it's like really okay or more than that, right? So in this case, of course, you could say really the individual person matters, right? And the problem is one of an individual person and her values in this case, And a good remedy perhaps would be to urge this person to think about reciprocity. Reciprocity as like an essential value for a functioning society. And of course, you could argue that it indeed is a value which is widely shared, right? So none of you will believe until you love for your brother what you love for yourself, says the hadith. And there's like multiple other religious traditions which make like a similar point, right? So a similar point in the sense that the idea here is that the individual, any individual wants to be treated in a decent, in an okay manner, and it's only fair, it is only just that you treat others in the same manner, right? Now this would be like kind of like a general response to this problematic of mutual understanding. Of course, scholars have like developed much more specific ideas about the ethics of encountering others, the ethics of dialogue with other people. But it's important to point out perhaps that many of these ethics start from the assumption that granting the other the right to differ and disagree is really an indispensable starting point for a debate. Okay, so you can make like a strong case, I think, for the necessity of an ethical reflection, of course, if you want to further mutual understanding. So that's not in question, but like many scholars today would ask like whether only looking at the individual is not is really sufficient, and whether this focus on the individual is not partly misidentifying the problem. So what do I mean by like, in which sense could we like misidentify the problem if we are concerned with this Austrian lady and her willingness, her wish to denigrate a particular religion? So we could answer, we could say this is like insufficient in the sense that if you look at controversies about free speech, in this case in relation to Islam, you see that there's like in most cases, the kind of statements which are controversial, which lead to controversies, are statements which circulate ideas which have been disseminated in European societies for many, many centuries. Right? So in the case of images of the Prophet Muhammad, so you can show that like the cartoons which were published 2 months ago, partly contain ideas, notions of Islam, which can be traced back like 1,000 years, right? As this book on the left, Faces of Muhammad, for example, shows, right? So the association of Islam and violence in this case goes back a very, very long time. In the case of representation of Muslim women, which is another like major topic of these controversies, like the history is perhaps shorter, but of course you can identify patterns and you can trace back these patterns into the history of Europe. So why is this noteworthy? It is noteworthy because it is clear that the problem is not only like the individual, but there is there are structures, let me put it this way, there are structures in Western culture which facilitate or favor the adoption certain views on Islam which are likely to create problems. Problems in the coexistence in societies, right? So the issue is not, it's not only like, it's not enough to only look at individuals, the moral characteristics of a person, and these moral characteristics may be deficient. This is indispensable, but it's not sufficient in the sense that they are like really broader structures which favor ideas about other groups, certain religions or cultures, which are likely to lead to conflicts. Now, that's an important point. There's like many questions which follow from this, many things you can do, many questions in relation to like what kind of images exactly are being circulated in educational contents, in literature, in movies, in music, etc. And so how can these images of specific aspects of a religion or people, how can they be modified? That's an important point. But let me add like one comment in order to avoid misunderstanding. So what I'm not saying here is that the issue is merely that there's like one group of people denigrating another group or the religion of that group or the culture of another group. This is not what these scholars, these researchers have been saying. Rather, what they've been saying really departs from a reflection on identity, right? And so this is like really the crucial point, and like one issue where we can benefit from. So what these scholars are saying is, when we find that the Western canon displays certain patterns in its representation of Islam, and that these patterns are problematic for mutual understanding, we can continue to analyze, and we will find that these regularities in the representation of Islam can be reduced, in fact, to a simple logic, right? A logic in which the identity of something is defined by contrasting it to its opposite, right? So the identity of something depends on its contrast to what it is not. So this is the logic, many people would say, of how identities are constructed, right? So one scholar put it this way: you go around the entire globe, when you know what everybody else is, then you are what they are not, right? Identity is always, in that sense, a structured representation which only achieves its positive through the negative, right? So like a group identity is defined and stabilized by distinguishing it from people who are in some respects really different, right? So now, so like one example for this is like this idea of like Western countries being free, as you see on the left with this Statue of Liberty, and multiple descriptions in scientific studies, in movies, and theaters, etc., of Oriental Eastern societies as being authoritarian, totalitarian, despotic, right? And so there's like a tradition of making these descriptions, which goes back like more than 300 years. And in this tradition, like the contrast to Eastern societies and to Oriental despotism is really important for making coherent a specific description of the West, of Western societies, right? So, like, why is this important? What follows from this? And I think this take on identities really opens up a new way of thinking how you can further mutual understanding, right? So in the first case, we have like a setting with two groups with this distinct, different identities, and there's like a good, you can make a strong argument to say that we need to bring in values of reciprocity and fairness in order to ensure that people behave, interact in a decent manner. In the second case, if you take a closer look at how identity functions, in the second case, you are led to recognize that the identity of these groups is shaped already by relations to others. Right? So that there's like not simply two groups which are totally disconnected, unconnected to each other, but identity is already relational, right? So the question emerges then, like how this relationality impacts the perception of others, right? So the the problem, in a sense, changes, and this is like an important field of research, like examining like the interconnectedness of identities. On the right-hand side, you see like in a famous book you probably know, Orientalism, which examines Western perceptions of the Orient, and on the left, a book called Occidentalism, much less prominent and influential, but an attempt to think about the West in the eyes of its enemies. Right. So let me add add one more point, which has to do with like how we discuss problems of free speech. So in conflicts about free speech, more often than not, people will appeal to general rules, right? So like in the example which I mentioned about the Doha debates, where the idea, the starting point is that free speech censorship makes a mockery of the arts, right? So the space of artistic production is simply posited as incompatible with any kind of restriction, right? So it seems that it's all like a matter of principles, right? And this is like, of course, can be contested, and many people have doubted it by pointing to the many exceptions which are made when it comes to free speech, and many differences which are that can be recognized in the way in which courts or governments deal with specific acts of free speech. Now that's of course important to realize that free speech is not necessarily absolute, that exceptions can be made and differences, but there's like a more general question which can be needs to be asked, and this has to do with the context in which such rights are exercised, right? So it has to do, this question, with the complex of behaviors in which a strong defense of certain rights makes sense, often in an intuitive manner. So from this perspective, scholars would like ask, would emphasize, if you want to understand why people make such a strong defense of freedom of art, artistic expression, why they defend freedom of speech and expression in some cases rather than in others, you need to examine, you need to inquire into the specific context in which these freedom rights are being embedded. So in the case of art, you need to examine what exactly is being defended as a freedom of art. Why does art matter so much to many people? So I cannot answer that question fully, but like to give you an idea of like what such an inquiry can produce, like as a description of the space of artistic production and consumption. And this is like one element of such a description, namely that art is valued and practiced in an expanding space of great economic importance. But there's not one answer to the question of why it matters. There's not one answer to the question among practitioners or those who are interested in art, like what is the purpose of art? Neither is there one answer like to the question how art relates to life, to society, and morality. Right? So art is valued and practiced refers to the fact simply that there's an art market which where people spend more than $60 billion annually on a global scale, and about like 3 million people make a livelihood by working in this sector. And this art market has like relays in museums which attract like enormous amounts of public and private funding, and which draw large crowds. And these museums are to some degree globalizing and now present all over the world. And the question like how they change in this process like is an important question, of course. But it's clear that this is like, these are like very powerful institutions which are socially in a very strong position. Now, the second point I want to emphasize here is that there is like people give very, very different accounts of like why art matters and what the purpose is of visiting museums or consuming artistic production. Right? On the one hand, like the importance of art is precisely argued in relation to an idea to simplify of art as self-sufficient, of like happening like in distinct social spaces where different rules apply, right? So many people would emphasize that museums and the objects which are exhibited in museums precisely are spaces which have no use value, right? And the only point of exhibiting objects in museums is precisely to present something which can be contemplated, right? And so that's the end point of art. And this has been theorized and popularized for 200 years, this idea of art as a distinct space where different kinds of rules apply with regard what you can show. Now, and this may sound strange, right? This idea of like exhibiting something which has no value other than that of being looked at for longer periods of time. And of course, it has been, this view of art has been strongly contested, and many people would disagree very strongly, and point out that artists have been for more than 100 years contesting this idea and contesting this insularity, right, of this idea of art like as a limited, restricted social space where other rules apply about what you can do and what you can show, etc. Right, and this what you see here, of course, is like one probably very prominent example of an artist, Banksy, who practices a different kind of art and a different engagement also with the art market. And so this is an art which is political. It's political and it's also like art which is accountable. It's accountable to society. And of course, it's an attempt to hold politicians, society accountable for what they do. Right? So these are like two very different ideas of how art functions. So I, of course, like my point is not, and I cannot decide between the two. Rather, what I wanted to show with this really schematic contrast is only to say that, like, first of all, that art is really greatly valued, and this also is important economically. So there's like, it's problematic to speak about free speech in a general manner without taking into account like how free speech functions in specific social spaces. But the second point is that like the views and doing on consuming art greatly differ, right? Inside like the world of art, the ideas about the ethics of artistic production vary greatly, right? And so there's like, to come back to the first point, it may seem like evident, and one may argue it is indispensable to start an ethical reflection on relation to others if you want to like create a solid foundation for mutual understanding. But this kind of like a very short look into the world of art would show that the status of ethics in a given social space may be contested and unclear, right? And so there are given certain social spaces which refuse like kind of like ethics, which is functioning in all spheres of society, and these are spaces in which different standards for moral reasoning apply. Oh, okay. So there's like, sorry, there's like one missing. So I wanted to conclude by simply saying that. So this like I want to try to show that like the contribution of social sciences is necessary and beneficial, right? It's necessary because like both these two cases show that like what happens in these spheres matters to what individuals do, how people argue. And it's also beneficial because if you think about history and identity, and if you think about how identities are constructed, you can identify, you can see like a potential for furthering mutual understanding, which has to do with recognizing that identity is in itself relational. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Frank Peter. It was such a really important and timely intervention and contribution that you have done. Now I would like to open the floor for reflections, questions, and also feedback from our esteemed colleagues. Now we have a precise 59 participants. I'm sure there are some burning questions. Yes, please, dear colleagues, raise your hand, unmute yourself. I see a long comment by Cemile. Please, Cemile, why don't you just share directly? It's such a long comment, and rather than reading, I think it's much better if you ask the question directly, please.
I am sorry that my nieces or nephews at home, so I couldn't be sure that anyone just popped in. But I'm gonna try. Dr. Peter, first of all, thank you very much for this exceptional presentation. It was very enlightening. My question is, given the fact that if we have been discussing free speech for now more than ever, that what if we change to narrative a bit, like a pursuit that we are pursuing? What I mean with this is that showing the consequences of being offensive and disrespectful in the long run, like collecting the data from the youth possibly affected by this kind of an offensive speeches, and then analyzing them and release the results, because it wouldn't be that promising, actually, the results. This is that I assume. And after then release the results, highlighting with the motto of our differences actually make us unique and exceptional. So this pursuit, do you think, would contribute the common respect and understanding rather than being attacking when something happens? Thank you.
Thank you, Cemile, and also Professor Alex and Professor Frank. I want to acknowledge that Cemile Cengiz also has been very interested in our programs. She has been attending our open houses, so a potential student she is. So just want to make sure, kind of like a quick note. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So the question is like, would it be useful to collect data on how people are affected by offensive images, speech, in order to highlight the negative consequences?
Indeed.
And thus then like make people rethink what they are doing?
Exactly.
Yes, I think that is like one possibility. I don't think, like, I think like basically there's like multiple things you can do in order to multiple things you need to do in order to start people reflecting on the problems of like offensive speech. And so I do think in this case of like the examples I gave, if you think about like a journal like Charlie Hebdo, these people are very, very much aware of the negative consequences. Right? They are very much aware. So that would be like a counter example for an example for the limits of what you can achieve on this level. They are aware. By this I mean that sometimes they have published issues of Charlie Hebdo where they put on the cover irresponsible journal, irresponsible magazine, right? So they're really explicitly, and of course that's kind of, you can say that's a bit ironic because it's a response to people who asked them, like politicians, all kind of people who asked them like already like 8-9 years ago to be more responsible, to take into account like how what they do affects all kind of people, right? It affects people who identify as Muslims, it affects people, other people. There are multiple effects of these images, of course, right? So, and they started then to proclaim, to posit themselves as simply irresponsible. And of course, there's a tradition to that, right? And that's what I try to allude to, this idea of like art for art's sake, or this idea of art happens in a distinct space and you can do whatever you want, right? Of course, you can really question whether this is logical, whether it's coherent to both criticizing all kind of people and then taking this, refusing responsibility, right? You can question the coherence, but so there are, I think there are limits of this arguing with responsibility, right? It's both important and it's not the only thing I think you can do, should do.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you
very much.
Excellent. Are there any questions, dear colleagues? We have quite a lot of participants on the line, and please raise your hand, unmute yourself, and you can share your question or comment with Professor Frank. And reflections? We're also going out of time, so it seems there's no questions there, professors, and thank you so much on behalf of, and I can see that actually some of the, there, Ayan, you always ask questions and today you're silent. You should ask a question or give a comment. I know that you want to.
I was trying to hide for a little bit, you know, one day on, one day off. But no, honestly, it was very informative. With the one thing I not disagree, but I wanted to touch on is when you discussed how identity and how it's relatable to other people. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, please, yes.
Oh, sorry. And how, I'm supposed to continue, sorry. And how it's relatable to others, but can't there be some identities that are formed innately from inside out instead of outside in? So instead of identities being formed by the environment and so forth, is there a way of creating an identity from within?
Yes, that's a very good question, right? So I think what I wanted to say is that many people for the past 30-40 years have emphasized a lot that identity is relational, right? So, but that's not the only view. I mean, this is not saying that identity is necessarily only relational, right? I think it really makes sense to inquire into this, right? To ask, like, how is my identity depending upon relations to other groups from which I distinguish myself, right? I think that's really an important question. It's a kind of like, there's a responsibility to ask this, but it is not to say that this is simply that you can explain identity only in this perspective, right? But then on the other hand, like to say that identity is simply only like identity, like emerges from innately, as you put it, I think that's difficult to explain. Like, how would that function? Would that happen in society? Right?
It would be relating it to our DPCH program about human-centric. So in your opinion, all these different perspectives and all these different approaches, which one is human-centric and which one's most individual? Because I believe an identity has to be individual, because the problem is when we go into conformity and when we start defining our identities based upon other people's perception, that's where we have mental health problems. That's where we have people not reaching their full potential because they're held back by something that doesn't align with who they are innately. And for me personally, I believe identity should stem from how that person already is in terms of character, in terms of mannerism, in terms of what they believe in and sets them.
Yes, thank you. So I think like a basic idea for like many scholars in these social sciences would be that there's no opposition between individual and society. And there's like this kind of opposition, I think, was like implicit in what you said, right? It's about the individual and not about like what other people think. And so, and I think from a sociological perspective, many people would emphasize that individuality is shaped also by, first of all, your parents, and then like family, society, right? So an individuality is not like the opposite, right? Of you're not like less an individual, and also you're not less aware, true to yourself, if you encounter and if you deal with other people, right? So like social influences, like encountering other people, to mirror yourself in other people, to engage with what they say and their expectations, points of view, etc., is not like it's part of like becoming aware of yourself, developing individual personality, right? So there's like not a, I don't think there's like a, it's not so mutually exclusive, right? That's I think what most people, what is important to keep in mind, I think.
Thank you.
There are also a few other comments that I can see, but because of time limitations, I'll just read them. Fatma says, very informative session. And also Ayan earlier and a few other colleagues asked about the PowerPoint slides, if maybe a PDF version of it, if possible. If Professor Frank can share with me, I can share with the group if he agrees, if you agree. And also Hajar Lahab, she says, I believe that as long as we belong to a society, we don't quite have an individual identity. It gets fade away to fit into the community. And now we keep ourselves. Who are we? And I think this is the dialogical structure and agency relationship that it mutually constructs each other, right, Professor? That's something that you just discussed. So it's not a duality, but it's more like a kind of like a interaction that between them. So they mutually construct each other, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so that's 6:30 here in Qatar time. And thanks so much to both professors, Professor Alex and Professor Frank, for their time, efforts, presentations, and engaging with us as the Design Post-COVID Humanity program. We are extremely grateful, and we look forward to hosting you once again in the future, inshallah. A big applause to both professors.
Thank you very much.
So dear colleagues, we have two more presentations tomorrow, as you know, Dr. Nader Hashemi, and also we have another presentation by Jeremy Coons from Georgetown. And we are full on force and totally up to speed. And thank you so much for your attention and being here. I wish you a pleasant rest of the day and looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. Okay? Take care. Bye-bye.